I was going to have slides, you know, but and I didn't know what the heck to put on them. So you have to remember I'm a historian, and historians are word people, right? Unlike you scientific and social scientific types, you know, you live on complicated structures and this kind of stuff. We think about words and places and things. So what I want to do today is talk a little about what we're calling elitism, ideology, and pragmatism, which is a U.S. higher education perspective. Now, as you know, American universities find themselves in one kind of crisis or another just about all the time. We think it's a permanent condition, a state of affairs that's a constant reminder that American higher education is something of great value. It's sought after by large segments of our population, and it serves a remarkably wide range of interests. It has a whole variety of purposes and symbols and values, and these are often in conflict. It's an institution that has conversations constantly because the interest and focus of complaint and aggravation, celebration and triumph varies from time to time and place to place, depending on the observer and whatever the ascendant ideology of the moment might be. We're reluctant to define what we mean by higher education. Do we mean the institution? Do we mean the students? Are we interested in the content of the instruction, the context within which we provide that instruction? Are we interested in providing individuals with an opportunity to improve their economic circumstances, or do we want our children to achieve economic success that's greater than our own? Do we see universities as engines of power and competition that will allow America to maintain its international preeminence in the world? Do higher education institutions serve a public purpose or private? Do these institutions support personal aspirations, or do they serve business and commerce, politics, and ideology? Well, America's triumph is that all of this falls within our post-secondary system in one way or another. It's a complicated world we live in, and there's endless challenges of its own. But when we seek prosperity and peace, when we look for justice and commerce and contentment, we often turn to higher education. Everything we find wonderful or disturbing about American colleges and universities finds its expression in one or another institutional form. If we want to criticize, we can find easy targets. If we want to extol triumphant virtues, we have perfectly useful examples. Indeed, one of the primary achievements of American higher education is its extraordinary variety, diversity, its multiplicity of institutions and providers, its complex structure of finance, and its overall success that serves as a target for international competitors. Now, in spite of the remarkable success and stability of American higher education, challenge, change, and crisis remain the constant elements that motivate, threaten, and energize innovation. Now, some themes in American higher education are universal. Money matters, and it matters at all levels, at all times, and for all participants. It doesn't matter the same way for everyone, and the impact of financial issues varies by time and place, but a focus on money is at the baseline of American higher education issues, and partly this results from the historical development of our higher education enterprise. We're creatures of a highly distributed and individualized financial system in support of post-secondary education, from the very first sectarian colleges of New England to the land-grant universities of the late 19th century, from the dramatic growth of the post-World War II student numbers to the 21st century technologically enabled instructional business. America has invented a diverse ecosystem of post-secondary education. The U.S. government, unlike its European counterparts, is weak in its ability to direct education at all levels, for education in America is primarily not a national service, a state service. Absent clear national control, political actors at all levels seek to control higher education for particular purposes. And they use mechanisms of subsidy and regulation to achieve their goals. Public funds allocated to particular purposes influences the behavior of theoretically independent institutions and systems of regulation. And university operations standardize higher education for particular purposes. Overseas, of course, many countries that seek to compete with the United States heterogeneous higher education system operate on centralized systems of higher education and allocate resources in accord with national level policies and processes. In the U.S., however, we operate through a marketplace of higher education where funds for the various purposes we pursue come through a competitive process. This element of market-based competition is fundamental to the form American higher education has taken. Our institutions of whatever type and style compete for financial resources from many different sources. Some of the marketplaces are national, such as the research programs of the federal government. Others are entirely local, such as the competition for state tax-based funding. And to some extent, we compete locally, nationally, and internationally for students, in part to ensure viable academic institutions, but primarily to make our budget. Absent sufficient numbers of paying students, most institutions, private or public, profit or not-for-profit, will fail. Given the importance of money, any effort to reform or defend some element of higher education must closely follow the ebb and flow of funding that drives this American industry. When we or someone else wants something to happen in higher education, we and everyone else turns to the money. Much of the change in higher education results from shifts in the sources of funding sustaining our academic enterprise. Now, today in the public sector, we struggle with dramatic and now relatively long-term trend of declining public funding. Ups and downs driven by the larger economy, state budgets for higher education have fallen, then risen, then fallen again in a stair-step downward trend. We fall only to rise again, just not as high as before. Other consumers of state tax dollars crowded out investment in higher education, and we increasingly turn to various forms of market-driven aggressive price management, focused in large part on student tuition and fees. In this shift in funding required an ideological reframing of our purposes and mission, where once we focused on the service we provided to a nation on the move, and saw in the expansion of our public institutions the development of an educated and prosperous population capable of sustaining American prosperity and preeminence over time, we gradually came to see our work as benefiting individuals over the short term. If schooling produces substantial personal economic benefits to individuals as well as substantial value to society, the new argument went, the individual benefited should bear appropriate portions of the costs. Many of us find this reframing uncomfortable, especially for public higher education, but our fiscal challenges have been so significant that we no longer spend much thought on the principle of tuition payments and focus instead on the appropriate relative portion of funding that should come from individuals. As the conversations advanced over the last generation, we built a sophisticated rationale for the shift towards private individual investment in education. Our social scientists and economists conducted studies showing the lifetime return to higher education, demonstrating clearly that those who acquire a college degree will reap significant personal lifetime economic rewards than those who do not. We use this rationale to justify the constant tuition increases made essential by declines in public funding. And we look to our private college counterparts as examples of this strategy, since many fine liberal arts colleges and private research universities have thrived for generations on a diet of significant individual tuition along with other private investments. We have successfully transitioned America's public colleges and universities into fully market-driven businesses benefiting, like many other American businesses, from a variety of tax-based subsidies, primarily government-subsidized loans and other financial aid, but sustained by their ability to attract paying customers. Our arguments today turn on the calibration of the appropriate price to individuals for the benefits of a post-secondary education to them and to their employers. We have a wide range of tuition assistance plans for particular subsets of the college marketplace to fulfill various social or political purposes. And as we do so, we of course reinforce our commitment to the market-based rationale of higher education. Our students have become direct consumers of educational services, and they, like all consumers, seek the highest and quickest return for the lowest price. The shift to education as a consumer product carries with it the notion that colleges are responsible for the quality of the education and the success of the educated. We want college, like other consumer products, to function in a reliable and predictable way. Traditionally, we might have imagined college as an opportunity made available to individuals in search of an education, rather than a purchasable product. And the result of college, we thought, depended on the provider offering quality educational opportunities and the consumer making effective use of those opportunities. If students came poorly prepared, did not study, and then failed, we saw them as personally responsible for this outcome. But once we agreed that students purchased an education from a college with their tuition and fees and a subsidy from other sources on their behalf, the college as producers became responsible for the success of the venture. The shift in responsibility from student to institution is energetically implemented by various state and federal education establishments under the rubrics of accountability and completion. Completion is the code word. It's the code word for guaranteeing the results of a college experience in the form of a degree or a certificate. This notion fits well within the context that sees colleges as primarily producers of reasonably competent, entry-level workforce with a certain basic certifiable skills for business enterprises. State governments eagerly endorse this notion as they shift the responsibility for the consequences of declining revenue to colleges, and it's welcomed by crusading private foundations seeking to transform colleges into skill-based training institutes. The tools for achieving these goals require national standards of employable skills, universal standardized testing, and guaranteed completion and graduation for all consumers. Now, some who observe American higher education imagine that this focus on money and markets is new, that this attendant ruthless competition is a recent innovation, and that the emphasis on the commercial utility of higher education reflects a change in our approach. While we may be more explicit about competitive goals than in the past, America's colleges and universities have always been both competitive and focused on the commercial marketplace for their graduates. We need only look at the land-grant institutions whose charters and purposes are directly targeted on preparing students to serve business and industry and on pursuing research that serves agriculture, engineering, and commerce. This is not a recent invention. It's buried in the DNA of almost all public and private institutions, and we train students to be productive members of society, and while some will surely become teachers, social workers, and so on, others will become accountants, corporate managers, engineers, stockbrokers, nurses, and other members of technically proficient professions. We teach them to be nurses not only to care for the sick, but to serve the healthcare industry and earn competitive wages. This is not new. That we find ourselves challenged by those who hire our products may well offend us, but we have no place to stand, for we have been cultivating business, industry, and government as prime consumers of our educational products for a very long time. While it's possible, perhaps, for a few humanists, good people, all of them, and social scientists to live in ivory towers, everyone else attends meeting after meeting with industry advisory councils to ensure that what we teach is what the marketplace wants. We track what happens to our graduates, and if too few of them get jobs, we're mortified and seek solutions to the ineffective production process that turned out unemployable graduates. Fortunately, in spite of some overheated rhetoric from various quarters, most college graduates get jobs and do fine. The unemployment rate for college graduates is vanishing low, and some of the complaints about the quality of our products have now turned to complaints that we don't produce enough of them. All of this is not to say that what we see around us today is good news, that the university is in good shape, and we should not worry. We should worry, because our history has not prepared us well to engage in full-time competitive commercial warfare. We still carry with us a memory of political leadership that saw universities as serving the public good and deserving of continuous, stable support. As we struggle with the markets and the changes in the market continues to bring to our business model, we can identify elements in our institutional profiles that serve to illustrate what matters today in higher education. Let us take research. This is the quintessential product of the elite American university, whether public or private. Research identifies the elite university. Research, however, is not an abstract exploration of interesting phenomena. It is a competitive product. The American Research University is a quality engine that competes with others of its ilk to generate the most and the best research products the marketplace can define. The competition is exceptionally well developed in the United States and focuses on funded, peer-reviewed, published research. This is a ruthless system that trains competitors to develop research proposals, secure funding, do research, publish results in prestigious journals, and then to repeat the cycle again as often as possible. The researchers themselves invented and mostly manage this self-referential system through peer reviews for research and for publication of research results in prestigious journals. While the federal government, foundations, and some commercial enterprises can influence this process by adding or subtracting funding or by identifying areas of study, the researchers themselves run the quality research competition. This process has internalized a commitment to competitive excellence, not excellence defined as an abstraction relative to values or philosophies, but excellence defined through the operation of a sophisticated marketplace. One only needs to look at the endless league tables now in international enterprise that seek to measure the competitive research success by counting and scoring publications in peer-reviewed journals. This competition, which turns on quality as determined by peers, is actually a competition that rests on money. Money matters because the cost of research, especially in the most prestigious scientific fields, is high. And only those institutions that can recruit the best faculty and provide a suitable research platform will succeed. Moreover, the international community has accepted the proposition that competitive research stands as a marker of international preeminence. Absent a strong competitive research university sector, no nation can hope to see itself among the major world powers, and country after country has engaged in the development of research universities and allocated substantial public funding in support of those enterprises. The international league tables serve as a relatively inexact but nonetheless closely followed indicators of success. The goal is to beat the US. Lest anyone imagine that research is a prestige token only for large universities, a review of the web pages of prestigious American liberal arts colleges will clarify the issue. Not one appears without a feature on the research triumphs of faculty, the grants won, the publications appearing in prestigious journals, the prizes and awards earned by the undergraduate institution's research faculty. These small institutions may not have many research superstars, but they require some number to demonstrate that their faculty competes within the same context of distinction as their larger public and private counterparts. This distinction, they believe, supports the recruitment and retention of high-quality students. Now, although high-quality, intensely competitive elite institutions, public and private, college and university, may only represent a minority of institutions and serve only a fraction of 18 to 24-year-old students, they set the tone and define the parameters of undergraduate institutional distinction. The competition among institutions in America has given us a complicated set of institutional types. At one time, we might have imagined classifying institutions in reasonably defined categories, perhaps emulating the California Master Plan and imposing its rigid structure on the rest of the nation by identifying research universities, state colleges, community colleges, each group of institutions serving different constituencies, even if conforming to some baseline academic standards defined by accreditation. competitive world, however, these categories proved too inflexible. Teachers' colleges became state colleges became universities. Universities sought to become research universities. They framed and reframed their missions and purposes in terms of the participation in the elite competition of highly selective colleges and research universities, even if they competed for students from much less exalted constituencies. For a while, many states participated in this competition, increasing funding for their public institutions to support nationally competitive research enterprises and selective undergraduate education. Second or third tier universities, while unable to compete with the best, could nonetheless redesign themselves to look like and function like the best. So they invested in campus improvements, residential facilities, student amenities, competitive sports teams, and faculty research support structures. This notion of everyone competing with the best could not be sustained forever on the tax base of an increasingly restive public, and states found it harder and harder to meet all their obligations. Colleges and universities, always significant political actors, found the sympathies of their legislative patrons attenuated by the demands of many other more immediately critical constituencies, whether prisons, roads, social services, health care, or K through 12. Yes, they said, our legislators, the university is critical to our state, but they also know that the universities would find ways to sustain themselves even if their budgets declined. Indeed, the ability of many public institutions to avoid visible catastrophic results from declines in funding, while admirable, carried with it a strategic political weakness. If funding for prisons were cut, the result would be a riot. If police funding were cut, public safety would fail. If healthcare funding declined, the emergency room overflowed. But with a loss in university funding, nothing much visible happened. Tuition went up, but financial aid went up too, and the impact was variable and non-dramatic. No one fired large numbers of faculty, and the institution rarely closed major programs or took some other dramatic action. Instead, it froze new hires, it substituted adjuncts for regular faculty, it allowed some marginal programs to die off, it consolidated off-campus programs, and it allowed tuition and fees to rise. And nothing that appeared in the news as catastrophic. Worse yet, in the lead up to a budget cut in the public sector, university people often talked about the end of the world. They talked about the decline of the university. They talked about the dire things that would happen. But when the budget came, it often was not quite as bad as anticipated. The university felt relieved and thanked the legislature and the governor for not doing worse. On the new budget, lower than the previous year, required adjustments that, while they may have weakened the institution, failed to make the news. Universities also discovered that as they made adjustments to their programs on the margin to accommodate lower state revenue and harder to acquire tuition and fee funding, the structure of their expenditure changed. The non-academic employee count grew faster than the academic employee count. And also, it was fun to blame administrators. The real growth was in various forms of support personnel for student services of all kinds, research managers, and staff to implement the ever-increasing mandated regulations from both state and federal sources. As the institutions became over-regulated on one side and highly responsive to every student issue on the other, they created programs, experts, and managers to deal with the consequences, each one requiring an office, a staff, and an operational budget. The academic personnel of the institution remained more or less stable, teaching a more or less stable, although perhaps slightly increasing student population. New revenue or savings from efficiency projects ended up subsidizing the service and regulatory enterprise of the institution rather than enhancing the academic count. Now, some of this shift to staff over faculty reflects a growing interest in separating out university content from university context. Traditionally, residential colleges and universities married content and context under the presumption that the context of a residential college or university formed a significant part of instructional value acquired. With the advent of multiple technology-mediated systems for instruction, it became relatively easy to separate out many elements of the content from the contents. Content, moreover, is much less expensive than context. Although these systems offered a means for colleges and universities to expand their markets without adding expensive facilities and permitting them to reach new audiences, they also suggested that the high-cost, high-touch, personal educational model might not be necessary and have as much value as its cost implied. So far, this movement remains somewhat on the margin, but as learning management systems, highly sophisticated self-paced instructional operations, and fully accredited online degree programs emerge, these alternative avenues for a traditional college degree may well undermine many residential campus environments. Although the newer learning systems reach some significant new audiences, the mainstream market for undergraduates still continues to place a high value on exceptional student contexts. Since most instructional programs are more or less equivalent, chemistry is chemistry, macro and microeconomics are standardized, colleges of all types, public or private, compete to create instructional and living contexts that can attract and hold reasonable numbers of paying students. College needs something on the order of 1,500 to 2,000 students to survive, and recruiting a sufficient number without deeply discounting tuition prompts a competition for quality housing, quality student amenities, such as rec centers, and elegant dining, and a host of student activities programs, including intercollegiate sports and honors programs that enhance the residential experience. Yes, instruction needs to be good, and the faculty responsive, and the placement of graduates reasonably effective. But one of the key differentiators among institutions of all sizes is the quality of this expensive context. Once investment in student context requires long-term capital for facilities, but whether this improvement will lead to sustainable increases in paid enrollment remains to be determined in many cases. America's private colleges and universities often have an advantage in this financial challenging time. They've been in the marketplace forever, and their business model is tuned to the acquisition of funding from tuition, grants, contracts, and private investments of foundations and donors. They have always sought to take advantage of every state and federal program for which they can be eligible, especially those that support student loans and other forms of student subsidy. Their market focus and close attention to the revenue that sustains their enterprise prepared them better for the current world than many of their counterparts in the public arena. They have always made adjustments to keep their expenses and revenue more or less in balance, and their faculty, staff, students, and alumni all understand that the revenue requirements are essential for success. The number of smaller institutions that will and have go out of business reminds their colleagues of the inexorable requirement of adequate revenue. In all of this, the elite institutions of American higher education remain remarkably stable. These privileged college and universities, public and private, have revenue models that can sustain significant change, buffer downturns, and capture benefits from recovery. They have large endowments, high-quality name brands that permit selective student admissions, good faculty and facilities, and significant alumni networks that support graduating students for jobs and contacts. Public members of this elite group are almost all major research universities. Many have developed multiple sources of revenue that make them less dependent on the state. And the research universities compete intensely against each other. Some move up, others move down, but overall their positions within the hierarchy of federal funding remains remarkably stable. Few fall a long way or rise up a great distance over time. So let's predict the future. What can we expect? Will we see the massive disruption of higher education that many of our commentators hope for? Probably not, as the variety and complexity of American higher education makes it highly resilient. At the same time, new delivery systems will emerge that will reach new markets for post-secondary education, but without necessarily destroying the traditional ones. Will technological solutions bring higher education to the masses at low cost and high success rate? Technology will bring higher education to many new audiences, most likely for certificates and other special training credentials. They may well have a high success rate for some students in some fields, but they are not likely to remedy the structural deficiencies in K through 12 student preparation. Will we see a series of institutional closures as smaller public and private universities fail to attract adequate student numbers and to maintain state revenue to sustain their enterprises? Yeah, we'll see some small private institutions fail, be bought out or consolidated. Marginal public institutions may last somewhat longer, as they often have local political constituencies that sustain them well past the point of financial viability. But they, too, may end up consolidated into larger enterprises and campuses. Will the elite continue to be sought after by students in large numbers, even with their high tuition? Well, the elite, public and private college and research university, will continue to thrive and prosper, as their marketplace is mostly price insensitive within the context of these institutions. A few good but not quite elite private colleges may fall below the mark, and some public universities will fall out of the prestige competition, but for the most part, the elite will do fine, as they always do. Will innovations in testing and measuring learning achieve universal acceptance and validity that can sustain accountability linked to funding at a national level for all institutions? Well, a lot of work's taking place on systems for measuring critical thinking and other learning attainment. It's likely that the measurement model will work best for those quantitative disciplines with relatively low humanistic and ideological content. We historians and others of our ilk will likely find it difficult to agree on the definitions and content of testing systems. However, the growing sophistication of data acquisition technologies may put the federal government in a position to control higher education policy through the operation of universal standardized data-based evaluation systems. The current effort to create a federal ranking scheme is the latest version of this initiative, but previous efforts to create national student unit record systems speak to the same goal of creating national accountability and therefore national policy control over the current disaggregated system. The one thing that's sure is it will find the controversy and criticism that is a constant companion of American university life will remain intense and unresolved. Thank you.